8 years of from announcing the CDM in Kyoto all the way to actually entering into force. And we used that time, foolishly perhaps, but in building a portfolio that by the time that Kyoto actually started to operate, we had a very large, probably the largest portfolio of CDM projects in the world.
Which was largely built on our willingness to work at a discounted rate in return for some exposure to the credits, that was highly prospective. So we were taking risk at the time.
I think the greatest challenge at the beginning was the vagueness of the rules produced by the climate negotiators. In the meantime, I've learned that's most of the times deliberate, because they like this, what they call constructive ambiguity. But lawyers and business hate it. They want to have clear rules. Doesn't matter what the rules say, as long as they are clear and you can build something on it.
The early challenges was when we were doing early transactions or early projects, people wanted to, off the back of the CDM, really create a new commodity called carbon, but there was no legal definition of it. There was no real guidance other than this sort of concept of a CER. There was nothing else in terms of a forestry carbon. And so our challenge really was to say, okay, we have this overriding sort of legal document, but we now need to make it commercial. The first sort of terminology that did emerge was what was called an emission reduction purchase agreement, an ERPA, and they were the first documents that really the World Bank's Prototype Carbon Fund used. But even I think our very first deal was one with Eco Securities in Australia on a forestry transaction, where we had to sort of come up with this concept of a forest-based carbon right and trade that into the legal documents for the investment.
Everything was forestry prior to Kyoto, and everything was not forestry after Kyoto. We became the kings of rubbish at some stage, with kind of landfills and big waste biodigesters and all these lovely things. Likes trees anyway.
Yeah.
And then early 2005, I mean, we spent the previous 8 years knocking at doors, and people would say, well, science fiction department's in the third floor, kid. Until eventually, kind of early 2005, EU ETS came online, and shortly after that, Kyoto. Yeah. And then the phone started ringing, and we noticed that all these people that called us science fiction lunatics started calling and asking for carbon credits, and if we didn't raise capital, we realized that we were going to be left behind. And it was fascinating to see the whole perception change, and change so rapidly that suddenly you had investment banks kind of looking for knowing about climate, knowing about carbon regulation, and so on. And it was, that is the most interesting part of this story. I mean, how quickly it changed. I mean, by the end of 2005, we floated a name. 60 investors initially. 30 of them were mainly American hedge funds.
The market got involved. So between 2005 and 2009, obviously huge trading in the global carbon market, very sophisticated banks and other corporates came into that market, and it became a very sophisticated commodity market.
The UN is mainly a political organization, and they were trying to manage a commercial market, so that the DNA was not there to solve the problem, despite the good intentions and the good efforts and the high level of intellectual ability of the people. Is just the DNA was not there to regulate a market.
CDM at that time was barely functioning. They had like 3 people in the secretariat, and nobody knew what they were they didn't know what they were doing. And we actually convened at the Canadian Embassy in London a host of fairly senior people. Teresa Ribera was the director general at that time. Henry Derwent was a director. So they weren't minister, but they were senior bureaucrats. And we came out of there with a package that we handed over to Stéphane Dion as president of the COP, which they actually took into the COP in Montreal, and that's where the reform of the CDM, which now is forgotten. People talk continuously about reform, but at that time it was a real reform, because there was nothing. I mean, there was barely functional.
So the biggest challenge was the great level of inefficiencies at the executive board, methodology panel, UNFCCC. The institutional chaos that we lived as the market grew was the largest challenge. We had no transparency on where the market would be going, when a project would be registered, when a methodology is going to be approved. We had no way of communicating with the authorities, and obviously as entrepreneurs we're patient, but as months and years go by and we have to pay the bills, the patience erodes.
Ten 10,000 projects were submitted to the CDM. Not all of them were approved, but it's 10,000 people running around there and coming up with new ideas that perhaps would not have taken place before.
Most of the new market mechanisms that I hear promote themselves as being different from CDM in one way or the other. So it became an example of how not to do things.
We built something that is amazing. Let's keep, even if it's a variation of that, but not abandon it.
From an atmospheric perspective, the CDM was negligible. I mean, we kept 1 billion plus tons out of the atmosphere in a period of time where the world emitted 100 to 150 billion tons, depending how you count. But in terms of creating a culture of an entire entrepreneurial class that was out there looking for ways to reduce emissions and to build out renewables and to build out efficiency and all the other components of the market, that's a much more important effect of the CDM than any particular tons that we went through, as we all know, the hoops of the CDM to get through. Again, it's atmospherically it's irrelevant, but in terms of culture and in terms of changing things, it's the most important thing that's happened in the climate debate.